Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 40. She's as headstrong as an allegory on the banks of the Nile. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, The Rivals. With respect, Mum. With respect, Amelia, Kate broke in crossly. I shall wear what I please. Now tell Pocket we shall want the gig immediately. As the maid left the room, Kate shook her head. Of course, Amelia hadn't actually said anything about the costume she had chosen, and she likely wouldn't have dared, but her agonized look had spoken volumes. Bea gave her a slight smile. If you don't mind my saying so, your dress does invite comment. Kate looked down at herself. She was wearing a version of the garment that Mrs. Bloomer of Seneca Falls, New York, had devised almost 50 years before as part of her program of rational dress designed to free women from the confines of their costumes. The trousers were fashioned like knickerbockers, buckling neatly at the calf. The jacket was snug but comfortable with reasonable sleeves. Both were cut of a sturdy green tweed. The Society's cyclists are wearing this in Hyde Park, she said, a bit defensively. She had seen a drawing of the costume and the Queen, with a caption that reported that titled Debutantes had taken to riding between the Achilles statue and the Powder magazine in Hyde Park every morning, wearing bloomers. On a bicycle, a full skirt was an invitation to a tumble. Bea raised both eyebrows. There's a great difference between Hyde Park and an Essex village, she remarked in a practical tone. People in London are used to emancipated women, but in the countryside, ladies who wear such costumes are thought to be, well, headstrong at best. And at worst beyond the pale. Kate couldn't help smiling. I'm sure you're right, she added. I'm always surprised by how easily the villagers work themselves into a lather about things, but still. She sobered, remembering why she had decided to wear her tweed bloomers. I do want to join the search for Betsy, and a full skirt is inappropriate for probing a muddy river bank. I would be weighed down by pounds of muck. She looked down at the black stockings that showed above the high tops of her boots. If people want to be offended by 2 inches of leg for pity's sake, let them. There are more important things to worry about in this world. Betsy's awful fate for one. The capture of the man or men responsible for her death for another. She thought of Sir Charles and Edward and wondered whether they had been successful in their search for Totten Brock. Bea sneezed. I would join you at the river if I dared, Kate, but it's miserly this morning and I have been overtaken by a cold. I think I should not walk about in the wet. She pulled on her gloves. I'll stay with Agnes while you do whatever you must. Agnes needs you. Kate pinned her tweed cap to the curl she had massed on the top of her head. Losing Betsy is a horrible thing, almost incomprehensible. She took up her aunt's heavy walking stick, which she had decided might be useful in her search. How dreadful it must have been for her last night, Bea said sadly. What will she do with her life now? How can she live, having lost both husband and child? Kate didn't say so. But if there was any good thing about this miserable business, it was that Agnes did not yet suspect that both of her loved ones had been taken from her, and by the same evil hands. She must know, of course, sooner or later. Kate found her gloves in a pocket and pulled them on, but let her first become accustomed to the magnitude of her loss, before she was burdened with an even greater pain. They went outside and climbed into the gig Pocket had brought around. Kate picked up the reins and they headed toward Gallows Green, where she left Bea with a pale and silent Agnes. With a heavy heart she drove onto the river Stour below Highfield's barn. There a subdued group of men and boys were working from barges, dragging the river bottom with heavy iron hooks. The banks had been searched yesterday, but as Mrs. Wilkins had so graphically remarked, the river clung to its dead and often yielded them tardily. The banks would be searched daily until Betsy's body was found, and Kate wanted to do whatever she could. So while the sad grey sky wept overhead and her heart wept within her, Kate climbed out of the gig, tied the horse to a tree, and walked to the riverbank, ignoring the stares of village lads who were clearly astonished by her costume. Nothing yet? She asked of a muscular, round-cheeked man who seemed to be in charge. She recognized him as the owner of the tiny grocery on the corner of the green. The grocer leaned on his pole, which had a hook on the one end. "No, Mum," he said. If what you mean is we have found little Betsy. His mouth was sad. We did find a boot, though. Pulled it up on a first drag this morning. I see, Kate said gravely. Betsy's shirt, her boot. If anyone had doubted the child's fate, it could be doubted no longer. Has anyone walked the south bank this morning? The river which marked the boundary between the counties of Essex and Suffolk was quite wide at this point. It was not very likely, Kate thought, that Betsy's body would be found on the Suffolk side along the north bank. The grocer shook his head. I was about to send me lad to do it. Let him stay and work, Kate said. I shall search. Begging your pardon, mum, the grocer said, alarmed. It's hardly a woman's affair. You might find her And what? Kate thought. Cry aloud at the sight of a dead body? Shriek? Faint? But she smiled as courteously as she could. Thank you for your concern, she said, and started down the footpath that followed the eastward along the winding course of the river down towards Manningtree. The distance to the mouth of the River Stour, where the river broadened into the estuary, was only 2 miles. The footpath was clearly trodden into the grass. She walked along it with attention, prodding the clumps of reed and willow on the river bank with Aunt Sabrina's walking stick. But her probes yielded nothing more than sudden banks of black weed and the occasional startled cry of a river bird frightened from her reedy nest. The river was stubborn. Or, if it had given up Betsy's body, it was not along the south bank. When Kate came down to the river's mouth within sight of the quay at Manningtree, she stood and looked out for a long moment over the quiet waters, thinking of the secrets that it held. The secrets of pirates and grain smugglers, and of one brave girl as headstrong and daring and truly emancipated as any bloomer-clad young lady who dared to cycle in Hyde Park, and whose last adventure had taken her far beyond the pale. Back in Gallows Green, Kate drank the obligatory cup of tea and endured a suspicious scrutiny of the 2 women who had come ostensibly to offer Agnes their condolences, but more likely to learn some new piece of information. Mrs. Wilkins, who had been so courtly the day before, averted her eyes from the sight of Kate's ankles. The other was a pinched, shriveled woman named Mrs. Bentley, her hair netted with black chenille at the back of her head, and her thin shoulders draped with a black knitted shawl. She glared at Kate, and as she passed the biscuit tray, muttered something that sounded like shameless, shameless. But Vicar Tappert, who had stopped in with a pot of soup prepared by his housekeeper, gave Kate a smile and a sympathetic glance. And Agnes, true to her generous nature, remarked that she had always admired the practicality of rational dress, yes, even bloomers, and hoped to one day have the opportunity to try it for herself. Practicality and comfort come first, I believe. Her smile was wan. Betsy enjoyed the freedom of boys' clothing, and I shall always have been glad that she took her comfort while she could. Mrs. Bentley's dark face went even darker. Yes, and look what happened to her, she said in a voice as grating as that of a rook. Headstrong she was, headstrong as a young horse, needed a rein. Marjorie, Mrs. Wilkins chided. She was just a child, and she's gone from us. Now's not the time for hard words. Miss Bentley lifted her chin. Well, I have but to say, don't I, Flora? And Agnes has ears to hear it. It's a sad time indeed it is, and I'd be the last to cast stones. But let it be a lesson. The glance she threw at Agnes, if not a stone, was stone-like and accusatory. It weren't just the breeches, neither. The child used to whistle going past me window, loud like any boy. I said to Mr. Bentley, I said, Crow and his whistling girls, you know what their ends be, I said. Her nod was confirming, and her eyes glittered. Headstrong, too headstrong by half. The vicar cleared his throat. And the greatest of these, he remarked, into his teacup, is charity. Mrs. Wilkins stood. Marjorie Bentley, she said with dignity, I am truly ashamed of ye letting your hard mouth run ahead of your Christian heart. Now come along and leave this poor woman to her grief. When they had gone, the vicar turned to Agnes. You must not take Mrs. Bentley to heart, my dear. Be glad that Betsy was, as she was, a carefree and happy child. And headstrong, Agnes admitted ruefully. Perhaps I should have reined her in, or asked Artie to be harder with her. She looked down at her hands. Perhaps she would be here now if... Please, Kate said, reaching for Agnes's clasped hand. You can't blame yourself. Agnes sighed. Yes, I know, but it's most difficult. Bee sneezed twice and blew her nose. I fear I really am perishing with this cold, Kate. Then it's time we started for home, Kate said. She squeezed Agnes's hand. You'll be all right. Agnes nodded. You'll come back when there's news. Of course, Kate replied. Goodbyes were said. Bea was tucked into the gig with an extra rope over her lap and an umbrella, and Kate took up the reins. They started off, the pony's hoofs splashing down in the thick brown mud. I think, said Kate as they rounded the corner of the green, that we should go home by way of Crayford Lane. It is less travelled and perhaps less muddy and most certainly shorter. It was on Crayford Lane, not far from the Dedham gasworks, that they found the body.